Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started in the interest of wrapping up on time. So, welcome to another issue or iteration of our MedEd Grand Rounds for 2024. Thanks for being here bright and early on a Tuesday morning, 7:30. I drove in with the sunset or with the sunrise. I guess most of you did too who are actually here on campus. It's actually a nice quiet drive. So today, our facilitators really need no introduction, and they're going to present to us on qualitative methodology and educational research strategies. Our very own Dr. Jennifer Alley, who is our Senior Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Development, along with Kevin Kidder, who is our Assistant Dean for Admissions. So I'm going to turn things over to them, and we'll get started.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Go ahead and get my shared here. Can you see the slideshow? Yep. All right, perfect. Well, great. Thanks so much for joining us. Yeah, we are going to be talking about qualitative research this morning. So I'll give a little bit of an overview, and then Dr. Alley will jump in and talk a little bit more about some data collection and strategies. So let's see. All right, so hopefully by the end of this session, you'll be able to understand the use and value of qualitative research, specifically in medical education. So maybe how you can apply some of these methodologies. Hopefully you can define the scope of qualitative methodology that is typically used in med ed research, as well as outline some study design principles, and then we'll also discuss the rigor and trustworthiness in qualitative research design. So hopefully by the end of this hour, you will be able to do those 4 things. All right, so maybe in the chat, or if anybody would just maybe chime in. I know it's early. Hopefully some of you had your coffee, but how do you all define qualitative research, and what do you think of when you hear qualitative research?
Something that's not quantitative, and I don't really know that much about it or care about it.
Well, thanks for being honest.
I think of descriptive.
Descriptive.
Your question, does it work? Does it work, or does it not work?
Okay. And what do you mean by that, Tom?
Whatever the process is you're evaluating, or the technique, you're coming up with either a yes or no answer rather than a grade from 1 to 10 and those kind of things.
Okay. In the chat, we have the participants' perceptions, opinions, and worldviews. Somebody said they think of surveys and interviews gathered through a variety of techniques, including participant observation, interviews, focus groups, art-based. Yes, yes, and yes to all of that. So, so great. So for this, we're going to use the Denson and Lincoln definition, and they say that qualitative research is a situated activity that locates the observer in the world. Qualitative researchers use a naturalistic approach to research by studying things in their natural settings and attempt to make sense of them and interpret phenomena in terms of meaning people bring to them. So really getting at that lived experience, talking about you know, sometimes with quantitative research, as Mike brought up, you're really starting with a question or basis, and then collecting data that is going to answer that, which in qualitative, you're still doing the same thing, but you're really letting the data kind of interpret and create that kind of situation, and the researcher itself is a data collection instrument, whereas oftentimes in quantitative, not as much. So we'll get into a little bit more of this, but that's kind of the foundation that we're going to use. So what are some typical methods to qualitative research? So this is just a slice of it, but these are kind of the biggies. So grounded theory is really looking at the development of an original theory. And that uses four kind of strategies, which are, data collection and some note taking. Case study we're very familiar with, I'm sure. So that's really looking at the examination of a person or unit, oftentimes with things like observation. We use a lot of case studies in the curriculum. That's that. With a Delphi panel, that's really looking at it, an expert panel, sometimes it's called. So using a group of experts to try to reach consensus. So an example of this was in my dissertation, I created an instrument that was attempting to measure the perceptions of the learning environment in medical schools. And so I brought together a group of experts in medical education that looked at my questions in the instrument and determined if those were really looking at what were they measuring, were the questions measuring what we were intending for them to measure. So that's just one example of an expert panel. Discourse analysis is really looking at communication. So that can be, whether that's text or, speaking, any type of really looking at communication itself. Phenomenology is looking at lived experiences. So again, immersing yourself in the experience itself that you are studying. Ethnography is, when I think of ethnography, I think of culture. So you're studying a culture or the aspects of culture. Autoethnography is just within yourself, so looking at one's personal ways of living. And then narrative inquiry are looking at human experiences through the interpretation of stories. So again, that could be, doesn't necessarily have to be text. It could be things like art or dance, things like that can also be there. So what type of questions are you asking that might lead you to say, hey, I think that this would lend itself to a qualitative study? So oftentimes you're looking at, how something is, or the perceptions that a certain group of people might have, or the lived experiences that someone might have. In an autoethnography, it could be about your own experiences and your situation within yourself. Looking at individual, group, or psychosocial interactions. So that could be how, one group may have perceived something and then culturally bound. So you'll see a lot of in qualitative research about the culture. It's really important to the work. And then here are just some study design principles. So, as I had mentioned earlier, the researcher itself is the data collection instrument oftentimes. So looking at their epistemology, which is kind of the philosophical underpinnings of their beliefs and how knowledge is created within the researcher. And then reflexivity, which is kind of the dynamic interplay between the researcher and the participant. So think about it as maybe the participants might change the way they act or something based on just knowing that they're being observed. So that's a piece of reflexivity. The conceptual framework, so really looking at that overall research project and defining what that looks like and the bounds of that. And then for data collection, again, this is just some of the ways you can collect qualitative data. So that could be through observation. So you'll have field notes, photographs, video recordings. If you're doing interviews, those could be one-on-one interviews, focus group interviews. That will result in things like transcripts, again, maybe some field notes, audio recordings, documents. So those could be paper, digital, emails. They could be photos or just depending on what you're studying. artifacts of sorts. Again, and then just other things. Somebody had mentioned surveys, so exactly, surveys can be qualitative in nature. You could be looking at literature, personal experiences, looking at things like other people's journaling, could be another way of collecting that qualitative data. So typically also qualitative research takes an inductive approach. So it lets the data lead to the emergence of concepts, rather than say with a quantitative study, you might be looking at a very specific instrument that measures one specific thing. This is letting the data kind of emerge the concepts that you will be looking at. All right, so I will turn it over to Dr. Ali, and she's going to start talking about some data collection strategies.
Thank you, Dr. Kidder. So I want to pick up where Dr. Kidder left us off, and this is a really nice table. It's from 2011, but nonetheless, I think it shows how we can think about qualitative data, particularly for medical education questions. One of the things that I want to just emphasize over and over is that while we're walking you through developing a qualitative methodology and a qualitative study in a very linear, seamless fashion, what is important for you to understand if you do decide to use a qualitative approach is that it is rarely direct and linear as we are describing. It's a messy, iterative process, and often data collection and your analysis is occurring at the same time. So as you're collecting data, you're engaging in that reflexivity process, and you're also starting to pay attention to the things that are emerging early. And then that may inform how you're thinking about, one, moving into the next session if you're doing interviews or focus groups, but also how you're starting to think about those codes that might be emerging from the data. So it is happening at the same time. So I want to walk through a couple of different things. So Dr. Kidder's already walked through how you can start to think about different types of qualitative data collection. And this is a sampling. There are multiple ways for you to think about qualitative data. And so I want to walk through that. One of the questions that we get, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. Okay. I want to spend some time on talking about rigor in qualitative methodology, probably going to Mike's comment earlier that I made a quote that you don't even count it, or you don't care about it. I think one of the misconceptions is that qualitative data lacks what we particularly in science like to call this notion of rigor. And this is a table from Academic Medicine's last page. What I want to point out to you is you can see in the purple how we think about quality criteria in quantitative design. And then in the green, they've outlined how we translate that to qualitative. And it is not that we are getting rid of rigor or that it is not as rigorous. It is that we are thinking about it in a different way. So we're using different measures. So we talk about rigor in qualitative methodology in terms of credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So what we are not doing is saying that what we collect for our qualitative data collection is necessarily generalizable to another population, because context matters in qualitative design. What we're talking about it, though, is that as you're looking at our data and our analysis and what we're seeing emerge from our data, it could theoretically be transferable to another population. You could see similar things emerging in experiences in a similar population. So one of the other things that is incredibly important for qualitative methodology within credibility is what we call triangulation. And so if you are using this is a way of thinking about multiple methods or of data coming into the same data set. So if you're doing observations, then could you also think about your field notes or your participation or your participants' audio or recorded journals as another document that you could bring into there to actually see where what these experiences are starting to coalesce around. And so then it's more than one data point that you're looking at. The other thing that is incredibly important is constant attention to your reflexivity in the process. Dr. Kidder mentioned, is your presence in the room changing the behavior that you're seeing? And so you have to constantly be aware of that. Are you introducing bias into your analysis as you're going through? So you constantly have to go back and forth and pay attention to that. Another strategy that many researchers will use is particularly if you're using interviews or transcripts or journals, as you've done your analysis and you've pulled these things out into themes, going back to your participants and having them just confirm your interpretation of what had played out in either the narrative or in the observation through member checking. And then several of us will use what we call peer debriefing, and that is using your peers to have them look at the same data and see if we're coming up with the same outcome in our analysis. So what I want to point out is that it is not that qualitative research lacks rigor. It is that it is defined differently, intentionally. So this is a really great resource for you to sort of get a handle on that. What I do want to caution you, this is not a checklist. So qualitative methodology is messy and you are really informing it. And so each design is going to look a little different. And so while you can use it as a guide, I'm just asking, please don't use it as a checklist because that is not its intent. Perfect. Data collection. Yeah, good. You're reading my mind. The other thing I want to talk about in quantitative, right? You are looking for power and you're looking for generalizability. Again, we are not. Context matters. Most qualitative methodologies use purposeful sampling. That is, you are looking specifically at a specific group or phenomenon in a specifically bound context. Therefore, you're going to use purposeful sampling. So it may be theoretical. You may choose typical cases. These are the typical things we're going to see. You might choose to focus on extreme cases, or you might choose a case study specifically related to a critical case event. Most of us look at that maximally diverse, which is you're trying to get the spectrum because that's where you're starting to see really the power of experience. As you're going and collecting data, one of the other strategies is what we call snowball sampling. So that would be if I'm interviewing Dr. Kidder about experiences as a new dean in a medical education program, what he may do, I might ask, are there others that you think that I could talk to that would help expand our understanding? And he might provide a name to me, and then I would reach out and see if that person would be willing to communicate. So while you might start with your methodology with a general idea of where you want to start, I think the beauty and the frustration of qualitative research is that that sample size might grow as you're engaged in the data analysis process. And particularly because data analysis is happening at the same time as data collection, and you're really looking for that saturation of themes across the data set. Once you've reached a point to where there's no other codes and themes emerging, that's what we call saturation. And so as you're collecting, you may realize, I only have a couple participants talking about this one specific theme. Are we missing something? And do we need to expand our population a little bit? You are looking for that saturation to come through that. And then we already talked about peer debriefing and triangulation. Perfect. As you're building your methodology, these are the things that I have found that are essential for you to think about on the front end, because it is a lot harder on the back end to try and clean this up. Think about your system you're going to use to keep track of the data and make it easy to analyze. Some qualitative researchers are set on touching the data and manipulating the data manually. Others can use Excel. I cannot. And there are plenty of qualitative tools out there that you can use to code and then move into themes and start to do your analysis. But think about that on the front end, particularly depending on how big your population size might be. That data set can become pretty wieldy very, very quick, and it's hard to keep track of. The other thing you have to pay attention to is that while we're not trying to generalize, should someone want to replicate your data collection and analysis, you need to make sure that you have fully captured what that looks like so that someone can repeat it if they choose. And so we're going to talk a little bit about when you're doing an interview, particularly for qualitative research, it's usually either semi-structured or unstructured. Semi-structured means based off of your research question, you've developed a set of guiding questions and follow-up questions that you may use with your interview or focus groups. However, what you really want is for that conversation to drive that discussion. So it's more of a discussion as opposed to, you're not trying to count how many people said the same thing. You are trying to capture those lived experiences. So that's important for you to think about, particularly if you're using unstructured interview or focus group protocols. You have to have a good recording of how those conversations emerge so that someone else could take that and move forward. You have to think about the researchers involved in this. So who's going to be responsible for collecting, managing, and analyzing this data? Collecting and managing it is, so if you're doing interviews or focus groups, you're going to want to audio record or video record, and then you're going to want verbatim transcripts. What you're analyzing, if you're doing video, you could be analyzing the body language in the group, right? So you need to make sure you're thinking about all of that on the front end as you're designing. And think about the resources that you're going to need to do that. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next slide, Kevin. We don't have time to go through every qualitative methodology, but one of the most common is thematic analysis. So I want to walk you through the process of this. Again, very linear, but as you're going through the qualitative process, this becomes commingled and very messy at the same time. The first step is really familiarizing yourself with the data as it is happening. So if you are doing interviews, you are recording those interviews, and then you are going to transcribe them. You can use transcription services, but as a qualitative researcher, it's important, though, that you reread that transcript as you're listening to the audio, because you want to make sure, one, that it's been transcribed appropriately, and then two, it's another way for you to really fully immerse in that data set. Okay, let's go on to the next one. As you're going through that initial data analysis, now you're going to start to identify those preliminary codes. This is the first step in coding. So you're going to start to take chunks of data. Can we go on to the next slide, Kevin? It talks about what coding is. Okay, you're going to take your chunks of data and you're going to assign a code. What is that data initially telling you about either a behavior or experience, and you're going to chunk it. And you're going to end up with what we call a code book. And that code book, you don't want to become too unwieldy. So you need your codes to be linked to the data in a way, but not every sentence gets a new code. You want those codes to start to form some semblance of themes across the data set. So that's coding. So if you take an interview, if you ask a participant a question, talk to me about your experiences with navigating educational space, active learning educational curriculum development. That's a very open-ended question, and it's going to go all over the map in terms of what you're going to get back. What you're going to want to see in the data set is if they talk about the process, then you could think about coding at a process at your first step. Or if they're talking about behaviors as they engage in developing their session, then you can code it at that level. Your coding is going to be iterative, and so that might evolve. In the last qualitative study that I did, I ended up with 3 code books as I was starting to search for themes, because I moved from what are they talking about in terms of process? Are they talking about in terms of beliefs? And so that's one way to think about it. As you're going through that data, then what's going to become apparent, linked to your research questions, but not driven by your research question, are these themes and patterns. And you're going to want to start to just pay attention to those and start to develop those across your coding. And then you're going to engage with your co-investigators and start to review those themes. Do we have the right names for the themes? Are the themes generated from the data? And you're going to want to develop what we call a thematic concept map. And here's just a sample of one from a recent study that I did. Across 28 interviews, what we ended up with are 3 themes. And then underneath of that, you can see the sub-themes that started to emerge. So these are themes that emerged from the data set from that qualitative study. For each of these themes, we developed a definition. We have a way of thinking about how those themes present, and we have salient quotes to actually describe these themes in the analysis. Okay. And let's go on to, we can go, yeah, we've done that. We've done that. And let's talk about, and then writing the analysis. And this is the last step. So once you've done all of that, then you're going to tie it together and pull it back into your research questions. And then that is where all of this comes together. What I have found is that sometimes people will ask, well, do I use my research questions to define and name my themes? No, not necessarily. What you are paying attention to is the research questions you asked and how that data is presenting, but you're going to use your research questions in writing the analysis, not necessarily in steps 2 through 5. And that's a key component of this. Perfect. So we wanted to make sure we left you with a couple of things to just tuck away. Qualitative research is not simple. It's not the easiest path, which is a misconception. It's time intensive. It requires that you build trust while maintaining your objectivity because you are part of the instrument of your research design. So you have to be aware of how your presence may change behaviors, build that into your methodology and into your analysis and into your limitations. And it's very easy for us to lose sight of our own objectivity, particularly when we become enmeshed in the populations that we are studying. You have to pay attention to your subjectivity and realize that your own biases and experiences may influence the ways that you are starting to think about your coding and thematic development, and just keep that balance in check as you're going. And so we want to spend the last little bit really working with you all to think about what are the med ed questions that you have that you think are lending themselves to qualitative research, and let's start to work through those. So we're going to open the floor for discussion.
Hi, so I think I was thinking through a potential question that I've had. I haven't seen a lot in the literature about the ways that we are preparing students for virtual interviews, particularly when they're applying for residency, because that's a relatively new thing in the last, since the pandemic. And so I haven't read a ton about that, but I wondered if there was an opportunity for us to study that. Is there a way to standardize or prepare them for virtual interviews? Because it is a bit different, I think, um, from in-person interviews. And like, how do you set up your environment? Do you blur your background or do you create a background? Like what are some things that we can do to better prepare them to present themselves well during these interviews? So I think that's a qualitative question more so than a quantitative one.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. So I guess let me ask you this first question. So whose experiences, and maybe it's both, are you most interested? Are you interested in the program directors? Or are you interested in the students' experience in that preparation phase?
I think the students, because it's new ground for them, right? So, they may have interviewed, maybe at this point, they interviewed for med school virtually, or had some element of that, but I guess the pressure is on so much and there's so few typical interviews. And so I think the students' experience in my mind is probably more important for my question than the program directors. And then also, can you tip the scale on their likelihood of matching by improving the interview experience, right? Because once they're offered an interview, then that's the group of programs that they get to choose from, I guess, as far as like where they could potentially go. And so you're narrowing down their pool of potential locations. And so can you tip the scale for them by, I don't know, interview coaching or changing something within the environment of their virtual interview? So
Yeah, so I'm hearing a couple of things and I want to emphasize. So first, understanding the student's experience with preparation for virtual interviews is one. And then you're talking now about what could be almost a mixed method study design. And that is if, based off of what the student's experience with preparation for interview, do you see what's the outcome in terms of the match? So that's actually a mixed methods design where you've blended qualitative from the student experience to quantitative outcomes. So as you think about the questions you would want to ask your students for qualitative, mixed methods is another talk. We can talk about that later. As we talk about the student's experience, I think you'd have to ask what's the first question you would want to ask them to understand their experience?
I think for interviews, specifically for that element, I think their level of comfort, their, anxiety, that element I think is huge. What if all the what ifs, what if my internet goes out? What if, like there are all these, I think that those are elements that affect your interview, like the way that you perform in your interview when you're nervous about things that are outside of your control. And not to say that those things didn't exist in a different form when interviews were in person. What if your car breaks down, or what if you're late to, your in-person interview? But these are a bit different now than those sorts of things. And so like, what if my child walks into my room when I'm interviewing, those sorts of things that didn't exist in in-person interviews. And so I think that element of the experience is what are the stressors, and maybe what have you done in order to decrease the likelihood of such stressors? Like, do they ensure that they have a backup internet source, or do they lock the door so that their kids, or do they have a babysitter while they're having the interview or whatever? Like what are they doing to improve those? I mean, decrease the likelihood that they'll have some of those stressors.
Dr. Kidder, I'm going to punt it to you. So I've heard sort of the overarching question. Now, I guess, Dr. Washington, and we'll lean into Dr. Kidder. What's the best methodology qualitatively to answer that? And is there more than one?
Yeah, I think definitely more than one. It was interesting when you said mixed methods. That's exactly where my mind went, because it was kind of like, oh, you could also do an intervention and say, okay, this group, had, these preparation tools. Did they match at a higher rate? That's the quantitative piece, with the lived experience being the qualitative piece. I think for this, I would maybe my initial thought is focus groups, right? This isn't something that's super sensitive or a topic that people might be uncomfortable talking about. Where one-on-one interviews would make the most sense. And also, I think this could be a good place where in focus groups, the participants can play off each other, right? So, oh yeah, no, I experienced that too. Or, oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I didn't even think about it, but yeah, I totally experienced the same thing. So I think this could be a topic where focus groups might make a lot of sense. You could also do, a survey is sometimes easier to get participants. It's a little bit less of a barrier. They can do it on their own time, where with focus groups, you're having to rely on, scheduling and, getting the participants either physically or virtually together. Whereas, a qualitative survey might just be an easier way to collect data, just depending. But that's my initial thought, was this could be a great mixed method study just based on what you were talking about. But thinking about just the qualitative piece and the lived experiences of the students, it might be also interesting. The first question Dr. Ali asked was, are you looking at the students or the program directors? It might be interesting to get both of their perspectives and see what maybe the students aren't, maybe they're stressing over something that the program directors aren't even looking at or looking for. And so just maybe seeing where the relationship between what the program directors, barriers are to these virtual interviews and the students.
You know,
Right.
that prompts the concept that we already have the data on our multiple interviews over the past several years. Compare that to student outcome through their 4 years to graduation. That would be interesting to see if it's predictive in any way.
Which is a very
It's been
quantitative, yep, mixed methods approach
Yeah.
to that. Yep.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. Well, Dr. Washington, we'll look forward to you fleshing out that research question. What other questions are you all thinking about in terms of what might be potential for a qualitative med ed study for you?
Swappin put one in the chat. He said, how do medical students at the Burnett School of Medicine perceive the role of clinical microbiology in their overall medical training?
Oh, yep. Okay. You want to take it, Kevin?
Yeah, so how do medical students at the Burnett School of Medicine perceive the role of clinical microbiology in their overall medical training? Yeah, I think this is another one. So you're asking really about their experience in the curriculum. So again, this could be, my mind also went to mixed methods here. If you're looking at outcomes on how they perform, or if you're just looking at their perceptions. So if you're just looking at their perceptions, again, things like focus groups. I think when you're thinking about collecting data, whether that's in an interview form, whether that's in a group setting or like a focus group or a one-on-one, I always think about the data that you're going to be collecting. And I tend to go for one-on-one interviews when there are going to be things that are maybe uncomfortable for the participant to talk about. Oftentimes with lived experiences, those can be things that are maybe more private or things they might not be comfortable talking about in a group setting. Again, with this, I think there's less of a barrier to that. So you could do that in a group setting. And again, you're going to get some of that confirmation bias when you're in a focus group. People thinking, oh yeah, I had that too. But that can also be a good thing because if you might not be, as a one-on-one interview, just thinking about everything. You're just going to be thinking about your one lens. But as you hear other people talk about their experiences, it can evoke thoughts and feelings that they may be experiencing. So I think a focus group could be a great way to collect this data. You could also get this through things like evaluations, which is, like a survey. So looking at it through whether that's open-ended questions, or you could do a combination of quantitative and qualitative questions. Again, if you're also thinking about performance and how they maybe performed in this area, you could look at things like standardized scores and things like that to see if there is a relationship between their qualitative experiences and their quantitative outcomes.
Thank you so much. I just thought I'll share with you some of my thoughts that I collected in my national conversation with my colleagues, and other med schools. So usually perception of the clinical microbiology and curriculum, the medical students generally view that clinical microbiology as a kind of a foundational yet very challenging subject. And so so they recognize that it's important for their understanding of infectious disease, but they often find it very abstract and difficult to connect with the clinical practice. And then so there is a that kind of a disconnection with at least to very levels of engagement is and appreciation of subject. It's varied actually. And then what happened is during COVID pandemic, basically the whole curricular deliberaties changed, and that made a significant influence to the teaching and the perception of microbiology, and the shift to online learning, as a matter of fact. And so there were a lot of challenges. So we had to come up with a lot of innovations, and this is something that had always been, in my kind of a domain. It's lots and lots. What do you call it? The education resources and tools to provide them, and so asynchronous way. Then they can take the journey to kind of be inspired. And then so that's basically, so that basically has led to some of the things that we've been able to do actually. We've been adapting, and just like Kevin, you just said, using the feedback, they're asking for more. They're asking for, let's say, more question answers, more even clinical pearls, the more clinical correlations, one-to-one liners and stuff like that, So, and we have given it to them, as a matter of fact. And so, at this point, my perception is, as I shared with my clinical my colleagues out there just 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago in the Salt Lake City. And so, and when you don't have enough time for synchronous teaching, and I know, and we've been able to actually, in the Burnett School of Medicine, we've been able to evolve and create more asynchronous, tools and resources. And when we make those available in a very interesting way that students can conduce it to students, learning style, it works in the MEPEC. So now what you now have to do, look at it in terms of the study. Thank you for some of the ideas that what I captured in this comment, and yes, Kevin. And so doing a focus group are doing a one-on-one and things like one-on-one has not worked very well. We don't see students very rarely come to us, by the way. And so maybe a focus group. So this is something approach maybe I'll have to come and seek your advice on.
Happy to help.
So there's a couple others in the chat, Kevin. So I think Dr. Lonergan talks about the use of coaching notes de-identified to code and theme that to see sort of the evolution from MS1 to MS4. That's absolutely a qualitative potential question. I think the thing that I want to make sure to emphasize is that qualitative research, like quantitative research, you still have to go through the standard IRB, and you have to have all of the ethical considerations around using protected information. So you would just have to write that up in a way to make it very clear of how you would protect the confidentiality of your participants, and then thinking about the ethics related to coaching notes and all of that goes into those coaching contracts. So you'd have to really think that through a little bit. But the question of how do coaching conversations evolve over time from MS1 to MS4, that's absolutely a document analysis is what you would be doing on this one. And so you'd be looking at the document for those codes.
Yeah, and I will just add, and this is just from my former hat as the assessment dean, I think we really built out Progress IQ for our environment. And so I would be, I'm not sure any other school is using it the way we are with notes. So I had just thought, maybe some interest in how other schools, but we might be using it here.
Yeah. And the other thing on this, Dr. Lonergan, remember, qualitative is contextually bound. So it doesn't have to be compared to another school. You are looking at your specific population at a specific time. So context this is not a generalizable question, but Kevin's point is nonetheless still apt. I would be you just would work very closely with Lee and the assessment team, and then thinking about it, but asking for your specific population in your specific context would be a qualitative.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And I think also thinking about reflexivity there too. So if the students know that what they're saying is going to be used as part of a research study, is that going to then impact their the discussions that they have with you? And it may be, but just thinking of, we were talking about reflexivity and how the act of research itself can sometimes change the behavior of the participants.
And of the coaches too. Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
Absolutely.
Of course.
And then Dr. Flood put in the longitudinal relationship with students in our curriculum is fertile ground for qualitative research, understanding students' perception of the role of mentorship in both SPT and LIC in their development. No, that's absolutely, this is fertile ground for some qualitative study for sure. And I think there's a group that's working on specifically related to the role of mentorship and empathy as part of the LIC clerkship. It's more of a mixed method study, but we are looking at that. But this is a really good ripe opportunity for folks to lean into. These are good. Dr. Kidder, can we talk a little bit about surveys keep coming up? And talk a little bit about some of the best practices for building a qualitative survey STEM to get you the level of descriptive rich data to actually do the analysis. We talk a little bit about how you set those questions up effectively.
Yeah, I think you just have to really think about what is it that you are trying to answer, and then, work from there. So you want to elicit the most descriptive response that you can from the participants. So, if it's something that can be answered in like a yes or a no, that might not be as helpful if it's, describe the experience, or, remember a time when you, were in SPT and blah, 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 blah. So I think helping elicit both their putting them in the situation that you're trying to have them answer, and using verbiage that's going to elicit the most descriptive response you can. So, I also think about journaling. So I did a qualitative study that really focused in on giving them a few prompts, but it was more geared to get them to write. So it was about students experiences with a program that we were doing. And so rather than just having them, answer a specific open-ended question, we had them journal, but gave them a few prompts that was just another way to capture those experiences, but it was in a way that felt maybe more natural for them to write about. So I think just think about what it is that you are trying to elicit from the participants, whether it's their experience or their feelings, or and then use verbiage that's going to get you the most rich response. Because the more, when Dr. Ali was talking about saturation, you want to get, as wide of a swath of, data that you can, and then hopefully you keep seeing, a lot of the same themes, and that's how maybe you've reached saturation with your population.
Very good, thank you. Well, should we move on to the resources and then maybe open the floor for questions? Yeah, thank you. So these are just a couple of the resources that we thought would be helpful. There are many, many more, but these are the ones that we're most familiar with. The first, obviously, software can make qualitative analysis a little less stressful and time intensive. It's still a time intensive process. These are a couple of the software packages that we've used and are familiar with. And then if you are doing interviews, focus groups, it'll be important for you to think about how you're going to transcribe those into text that you can analyze. You can use transcription services. The one that we both use is rev.com. They do have an AI tool. AI, I'm not there yet in terms of qualitative research because you are part of that research methodology. I don't trust turning over much of my analysis to AI. If you do use it, just like everywhere else, you have to describe how you've used it in your methods. Rev.com allows it, has a setup for transcriptions. If you're going to use it, I still feel it is important for you to listen to the audio and validate that transcription. I have not used it for theme development. Some researchers are testing this. Again, just because of my own personal belief that you are part of the research process. I don't know that I turn over theme development to AI just yet, but it's out there as a potential. And then obviously other resources. TCU has a really nice qualitative collective, and so their website is there. It's a group of qualitative researchers just sharing, and so it's a really powerful collective. So those are some of the resources that we both would put forward if you're going to think about a qualitative study. Then going to go on, and I think the last page is just the references we've used, right?
Yeah, it is. I will also just add one of my favorite resources is a good set of highlighters. I mean, that sometimes when I'm going through a transcript, I like to start my first, SWOT of just looking at different things as they start to emerge and codes with just highlighting in different colors. So it doesn't always have to be, software that can, certainly help, especially if you have a lot of data, but sometimes just, paper and highlighters can really help you kind of start with that analysis as well. Yeah, and some resources.
Very good. And then I think we can open it, Dr. Cantrell, for some questions.
All right, I'll get us started if that's okay. Actually, kind of going back to thinking about ideas where we might use this approach. So I have a question that's actually a large question, and it probably would entail a number of sort of sub-studies. But as many of you are aware, we've devoted a lot of time, effort, energy, resources to ensuring that our students are performing where we would like them to be for step one, with our outcome data being making sure that we as a school are consistently at or above the national average for first-time pass rate. And then also making sure that our students are prepared to take the exam on time as scheduled without significant delays that delay their progression in the curriculum. And we've thrown a lot of ideas at this, and we've implemented a lot of changes. And if in fact we move that needle in the direction we would like to move it, we're really going to have no idea which of that mini set of things that we've implemented are responsible for moving the needle. So I'm wondering if we could use this approach to start to evaluate the effectiveness of some of these individual things that we brought to bear for our students to get a better idea of which ones are effective and which ones aren't. And I really can kind of envision that we're not going to get exactly what we need, like in a standard survey. And we actually just sat around a table, Lee Page and I and Lisa Carpel, yesterday talking about the structure of a survey for the USMLE Step 1 course to start to kind of get at some of that. But I imagine like focus groups, more intentionally developed, kind of open-ended type surveys, those kind of things might be useful tools along with some quantitative data. So interested in thoughts about how to even begin to approach that.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely, I mean, again, another place I just thought of is cognitive interviews, right? So having them take those practice exams and then talking them through, okay, when you were answering the questions, what resources helped you in answering these questions? Or, I'm not a content person, so I don't know exactly what that would look like, but, really having them walk you through, okay, while I was sitting for this exam, here's what, here was my process for getting there. And I think that can sometimes help you look at, okay, the students who were successful in, this exam were really focused on, these, whatever it is, it's Saturday school sessions that they had. And, the ones that struggled, we're all talking about how they only use, Anki decks or whatever it is, right? So maybe having them walk you through their process of how they, A, got to the answers they got to, and then B, the resources they used that helped them get to the answer, whether the answer was ultimately, correct or not.
And so do you think if we took that approach, then we wouldn't have to have like separate focus groups that address each of these things that we implemented? Like, I can imagine having one where students are talking about Saturday school, one where they're talking about whether or not the CBSE practice exam was helpful, maybe talking about, getting U-rolled access early, all of those kind of things. So do you think we could get enough from
you could
one?
use a combination. I think you could use a combination. I think the one thing that I would, want to try to account for is performance, right? So if you get a group of students who are sitting around talking about how they used a specific resource, but it turns out they all failed the exam, that might not be, you heard what they used, but you would also want to be able to tie it back to,
Right.
was that ultimately a successful, strategy?
Yeah, and so in thinking about that and setting up your focus groups, would you take that into account as you invited students to participate in a focus group? Like, would you sort of set it up so that you had a mix of performance ranges or more defined performance?
I think that's also what, where you get into some dilemmas with, are you transparent about that? And then is
Yeah.
that going to impact the way they answer the questions because they know what group they fall into and things like that. So I think maybe with the focus groups, you can get at some of the strategies students use, and then with those cognitive interviews, get at or you could even just, cognitive interviews is a qualitative way to do that. You could really use a survey that could correlate basically the strategies or methods or tools they use to study and then correlate that with their performance. So that's more quantitative, but.
Okay. Well, I think maybe we'll have an offline meeting to get into the weeds about that. So I'll open it up. Anybody else on the panel or on the call have questions for our qualitative experts? I imagine that there are some other ideas floating around about ways to use these methodologies to get at questions. I'm thinking, in anatomy, even as we are kind of making some changes to the way anatomy is integrated into the curriculum, but also making changes like to the lab sessions themselves and the concurrent activities that are associated with those lab sessions. I think it would be nice to have some qualitative feedback on the effectiveness of those sessions. I think there's lots of questions we can ask.
I agree with that. And let me turn my video on. I'm very dark here. I agree with that. And the things that float around in my mind are things like for hollow anatomy, and this is more really Prasanna's thing, so I've kind of held back from mentioning this, but for our hollow anatomy sessions, we noticed that early in the year, the students are very engaged, and by the end of the year, they are toned out. They don't care anymore. And this year, we're talking about adding the way Case Western does, having exam questions, practical exam questions on the HoloLens, with hollow anatomy. And so, not like we can go back to the class that we just finished with, but what is the change in engagement with the class when they know this will be on their exam, rather than just, oh, it's just going to be NBME. I don't even have to look through the lens.
So I think, what is the change is a quantitative question. So how could we flip that to actually get at the qualitative component of the student's experience with the hollow anatomy in the latter half of the curriculum, right? So if you could flip it from the quantitative frame to a qualitative, what is it about the students that would be important for you to understand?
I think, well, and because that's not the only change that we've implemented, that was an example, but like Prasanna has used Kahoot in a session with HoloLens before. We are now moving to also try having the students in one pod have one student as the leader rather than the faculty member being the leader for everyone. So, the thought process being that they would be more engaged. And I think what we want to know about the students is what works for them to keep them engaged in the learning activities.
Yeah, okay. So student perception of and I mean, I don't know if you want to get so specific about technology, but if that's sort of the research question, then you could frame it in a way to sit down with them and have a focus group about, talk to us a little bit about the use of active learning or technology, whatever it is, Mitzi, that you're thinking about. particularly as we reach this point in the curriculum. Because I think, you know, I'm looking around the Zoom screen here. I think everybody would acknowledge that the further along they get in that MHD curriculum, they just become fatigued with us across the board. So it's not just in this particular component, but you could start to flesh that out, particularly related to your specific focus. So I think with the qualitative, it's so hard because, like Mike, we are all wired quantitatively, and so we want to know the so what. And what qualitative is getting at is, well, how does that happen? Why does that happen? All of the richness about the things that we can't really count comes out in the qualitative. So, Mike, I know you don't care, but it does matter.
I don't think that it doesn't matter. It's just, you know, my whole career has been quantitative and answering the question. And I just reflected back even to what Kevin said in response to Angela. You know, if we want to look at the hard numbers, what their scores are and what they're doing, that's quantitative. If we want to get them to feel how they're thinking, then that's qualitative. But that's, to me, that's just a little squishier, you know, where I'm just so set in the firm, you know, and that's the way I've been brought up. And it's such a hard thing. I mean, we do have student projects that are qualitative. So, you know, I have to, I have to delve into that avenue. And, you know, with you, Kevin, and Lee actually also being so well, is schooled in qualitative, we do have experts here to be helpful. So, I mean, it's just not my cup of tea.
It doesn't have to be everyone's cup of tea.
That's right.
That's the beauty of mixed methods. It brings it all together. Good. Any other questions?
I just was going to share too. You know, Mike, I was certainly quantitative for the first, you know, part of my training. But then I wanted more. So when I was doing educational research, it was like, okay, I got the questions, but why is, you know, what is the context around that? And so it allowed me to really start answering other questions that I like Dr. Ellie said, that you couldn't get from the numbers, because sometimes you would see something and you'd be like, but why is it like this? Or, you know, why did they answer this way? Or because, you know, you have these hypotheses and then, you know, maybe it didn't go the way you thought it would, but then it just stops with the quantitative, or with some qualitative or mixed methods. You can kind of, you know, put some context and the why behind some of those numbers. So I think that's what excited me about qualitative, was that it just kind of let me do more and answer more questions, because ultimately that's what you want to do with the research, is just answer those questions.
And I think that the qualitative research can sometimes inform your next quantitative study, right? So when you're asking questions like why did they do this? Well, let's say for medical students, you know, why, you know, how or why did this particular intervention that we did before make a difference now? Well, if it didn't, then you know, to try something new, you know, that could become a qualitative or quantitative study. And so I think in a certain way, qualitative studies, if you use it in conjunction with, you know, your quantitative counterpart, they can inform a quantitative study that is to come. And so I think we do have to understand why things happen, you know, or how things happen. And then you can test new ways to do things now that you understand the why and the how, you know. So I think they go together. It's just the way you use them together.
Yeah. Absolutely. Nicely said. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll say, I will hope the two of you are maybe open to being collaborators on a lot of projects, because I see a lot of rich, fertile ground here. But like Mike, as someone who was sort of born and raised in quantitative methods, I'm not even sure that I know how to frame a quantitative or a qualitative question So, you know, there'd be a lot of bending of your ears. So hopefully you guys are willing to jump into that. But, you know, I can see even within that umbrella that I mentioned, there are multiple projects there. And if we can kind of get our feet wet in this and get a toehold, I think that's a good way to really improve the, you know, scholarly output of the department as a whole, because these are things that we're all interested in.
Yeah, and I will say, so just from my experience, you know, you can ask a really good qualitative question, collect really good data. And just off of a recent project, I collected so much data. You cannot put all that data into one journal manuscript. It's just too much. And so you end up with almost, I think by the time we're done, we're going to have 4 manuscripts out of one data collection. So because it is so rich and descriptive, and when properly structured, you actually get some really nice outcomes from a qualitative data set. Okay, well, and yes, I think both Kevin, myself, and I think even Ali would be happy to have our ears twisted and help you all through it. We're happy to do that.
Definitely.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. I volunteered you.
All right, any other questions before we wrap up?
Wonderful.
Okay, not seeing or hearing anything. So I will extend our thanks and gratitude to our 2 facilitators. Great job. This was really informative. I learned a lot. I think probably everybody else on the call did as well. And we'll see you guys at the next grand rounds.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.